Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1137. We are progressing here. We left Richard E. Lind and his appeal to the heart soul, and that there was quite another form of thinking, rationality, understanding than the normal one. And as we pointed out, there has been a development in early antiquity towards thinking going into the head and thereby being more instinctual, being unaware, being automatic. This tendency, this change had great connections to the tendency to sort of make logic, rationality stiff, predictable, formed in a communicable system, imitated by everyone. And interestingly enough, this tendency was well established already 300 BCE in the Attic societies. And it's obvious from the logic of Aristotle that he thinks logic is already out there, already pre-constructed. And that makes for a very low logic with explosions. It doesn't have any predictive power. It will not work to inform your life. And therefore, I think most people today, they don't use rationality anymore, what the Indians call body. They use chance because that is always better than a pre-constructed, pre-made system that doesn't fit the situation or what is happening. One can also look at that from a perspective of common sense. How would the world, how on earth could it be possible for the earth to sort of follow the logical rules as they were outside of the world? And how on earth could these rules help us? The rules are communicable systems, a way of conferring to others what we have done, but not what we have done, because that is pre-reflective. And by saying pre-reflective, it is not anti-rational. It is rational. This is a complex, paradoxical thing that became to me very clear from Richard E. Lind's book, that the newly constructed rationality is not rational at all. It has nothing to do with rationality. It's a post-construction. It is like they lost rationality, and from how they saw it, the explicit part, the explicit side of the whole thing, that was the thing that was trying to copy. But that is absolutely wrong. This is not how to go about it. One needs to stretch into what is thinking, and that doesn't follow pre-made rules, because the world doesn't follow pre-made rules. Listen to the Theorem of Gödel. I have downloaded the audiobook by Douglas Hofstetter, Gödel, Escher, Bach, and it shows in a very clear way that all systems that are pre-made will fail, even internally. And if they fail internally, how would they not fail externally when you try to use them on the real world? The great Greek philosophers also lamented the loss both of soul and of thinking. And in lack of any other thing, they tried to construct a system for thinking. And we are so used today to thinking that is logic, this is rationality. But we know today, especially from Harry Yuval, that there are no successful people anywhere that uses that system, because that would mean direct failure. All rational people, especially the grand companies, middle companies, Stephen Jobs, Craig Vanden, IBM, they all follow the path of Edward de Bono. None has ever followed the academic classical logic. None has ever followed the common sense logic of common man. It has never happened one single time. And it doesn't follow quantum mechanics either. It is definitely a recipe for absolute disaster in every case that Harry Yuval checked out. And this is also the message from Kahneman, most definitely from the biggest research report ever to be put together by E. McGilchrist in The Matter with Things. No, we have more softer rules, but we still have knowledge. Well, we get knowledge, you could say also. And I would like today to take a book that partly goes into what I mentioned yesterday in lecture 136, The Cosmic Hologram by Judi Currivan. This is like we talked about power laws. Power laws means that there are predictability in all areas, and they seem all to follow a system of frows and developments, hills and frows. Those things are exceedingly interesting. I would say maybe the most interesting I read for quite some while. That, together with Richard E. Lind, sort of softened my ideas of this rationality, because it has a firm grip. It's 2,500 years. It has very clearly entered the normal curriculum, and it's easy thing to do to the mistake what is before with the after. And this, our whole physics, classical physics, is actually made after that mistake. It mistakes the explicit for the implicit, and by trying to do predictions using the explicit when the implicit should be used. Call it the superposition in ordinary quantum mechanics, or call it the implicit as a Bohmian supporter would call it. And oddly enough, it was also a point very much pressed by Edward de Bono, last year's sadly deceased Maltese/British creator, the biggest during the last century and partly into this century of the idea management inventors, explorer. He worked with at least 2,000 companies, many of them very big like IBM, NHK, Apple, the whole phone system in China and so forth. He was great. He became fairly rich at the end, and he founded a university in the capital, the little tiny capital of Malta, called Valletta. He points that the grand mistake of the Western world is confused before with after. There is an absolute, in this sense, thinking, temporal, and also spatial, absolute border between before and after. And we made that mistake early on. As I said in the beginning, 400 BC, to confuse it and then obscure it. And then once we lost it, maybe we lost the heart soul of proper thinking, we tried to regain it the wrong way and constructed all those systems. Heck, me for one, I was really into it, studying semantics, logics, philosophy and cognition, that in that time was very strictly into the after. Then analytical philosophy, there was a softening up with my thinking, actually coming from an analytical philosopher who made a doctoral thesis of Jacques Derrida's Sémination, and there he said that it was a system to his whole thinking, but with the system he meant this pre-struct after shock or shadow of the thinking. And I don't think there is a coincidence that in the cave metaphor they are looking at the shadows. More than a philosophical point, I think Plato himself was describing his own life. He felt to be living in shadows, that nothing was real to him. And that really struck a most genuine chord in me when I read Richard E. Lind. All these different people, Assyrians, Babylonians, all using the heart consciousness in the ancient scriptures of the Veda, the Upanishad, in the Tao Te Ching, in Mesoamerica, in Africa, an incredible amount of sources, all pointing to the same thing. And also when the loss came, how people lamented, cried over the lost thinking and feeling and intention. All was lost. It was not just one aspect of being human that was lost. It was almost all the important ones. And to be very hard, one could say the whole philosophical Western project of philosophy is this mistaken way of trying to regain it the wrong way. I think the turn didn't come until quantum mechanics in the 20s, the theorem of Gödel, the recent years, and I say very recent years, maybe the last decade of development within neurology, science of cognition. Gibson is most definitely a turn away from the Platonian idea of thinking as absolutely cut off from reality. That thinking is reality in some ways, but also not. So today I will look into one book, an interesting way of describing the proper thinking or the heart soul thinking, the rationality, with proper indications of how the world works, and they are all scale invariant, meaning that you don't go from the smaller things to the bigger. This book is called The Golden Ratio, The Divine Beauty of Mathematics, written by Gary B. Meissner. It's quite a recent book. Gary B. Meissner created Phi 1.618, the golden number, a leading website dedicated to mathematics, appearances and applications of the golden ratio. In 2004, he developed Phi Matrix golden ratio design and analysis software, which is used by thousands of artists, architects, designers and photographers in over 70 countries, as well as in cosmetic, medical and stock market analysis applications. In 2018, he authored The Golden Ratio, The Divine Beauty of Mathematics with Quartos Race Point Publishing Group, which sold in multiple international markets and translations before its 2018 release. Gary and his work has been featured in Da Vinci the Exhibition at the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas. He also was featured in a 2-hour educational documentary by EBS in Korea and has been interviewed for articles in the LA Times and elsewhere. I see if I can find that 2-hour educational documentary about the golden ratio. The book is incredibly beautiful, well recommended to read it. And I will start with 2 different excerpts from the book. And I would call the rules of this book, the Phi and the golden ratio and the Fibonacci series, as well as power laws. That is, power laws are those that ignore scale and ignore subject, ignore differences, what we take to be absolutely divergent aspects of reality. Instead, it fathoms everything. It's a sort of holism. This is from the very beginning of the book. What is Phi? Let's begin this ongoing journey of discovery with a basic understanding of this intriguing number. Get to know some of the people throughout history whose lives it touched and explore where it appears and the ways in which it has been used over the millennia. Represented in shorthand by the decimal 1.618. Phi is an irrational number followed by an infinite number of digits and is accurate enough for almost any practical purposes we ask it to serve. And it takes much less time to write and saves an infinite number of trees when printed. The familiar number 3.14, which relates a circle's circumference to its diameter, is represented by the Greek letter pi. Similarly, 1.618 is represented by another Greek letter, phi. Although it has taken on other aliases in different areas of history, in mathematics circles it is sometimes denoted by the Greek letter tau. Today it is more often called the golden ratio, but it has also been known in recent times as the golden number, the golden proportion, the golden mean, the golden section, and the golden cut. Further back in time, it was even described as divine, the divine cut. This divine golden number is unique in its mathematical properties and frequent appearances throughout geometry and nature. Most everyone learned about the number pi in school, but relatively few curricula included phi, where we'll use the uppercase Greek symbol phi to designate 1.618. and the lowercase phi to designate its reciprocal 1 through 1618. This is perhaps in part because grasping all its manifestations can transport one beyond an academic setting into the realm of the spiritual. Indeed, uppercase phi unveils an unusual frequent constant of design that applies to so many aspects of life, art, and architecture. As we saw from Judi Currivan's book, it also applies to economics, the height of people in different countries, war, earthquakes, chemistry, biology. Biology is very prevalent, especially in this book by Meissner. But let's begin with the purest and simplest fact about phi, which are found in the field of geometry. History records the ancient Greek mathematician Euclid as describing it first and perhaps best in book 6 of his mathematics treatise, Elements. A straight line is said to have been cut in extreme and mean ratio when, as the whole line is to the greater segment, so is the greater to the less. Well, it couldn't be put more simple. So where's the magic and wonder in that? Let's start with an example. If I ask you to divide a line, you could do so in many places. If you cut it in half, you will create different ratios. But the important ratio is 2 to 1. That the smaller cut is half of the bigger cut. So this ratio going on and on and again has this unique aspect of the golden ratio. The ratio of the whole segment A to the larger segment B is equal to the ratio of the largest segment B to the smaller segment C. In other words, A through B equals B through C. So it's a marvelous character on the constant phi. And to take the next step in understanding why phi and its mathematical properties have ramification beyond being an interesting exercise in mathematics, I'd like to introduce you to Phi Matrix, the software application I developed in 2004 and released with a new version in 2009. I learned object-oriented programming at the age of 54 just for the express purpose of creating this one program, which is now used by thousands of very talented and enthusiastic artists, designers, photographers, researchers, and scientists in more than 70 countries around the world. Phi Matrix makes it very easy to find and apply the golden ratio to any image on your screen. As an example, consider the line segment we just divided according to the golden ratio by overlaying it with the rectangular Phi matrix grid. As we will discover, the appeal of this golden proportion extends from designers, mathematicians, and mystics to doctors, biologists, and investors. The golden proportion is present in the natural world and is even intrinsically related to our perception of facial beauty. Throughout history, it has been used to create beauty in many great works of classic art, architecture, and it's still in use today to create visual harmonies in graphic design, product design, photo and video composition, logos, user interfaces, and much more. Some believe it's even found in the proportions of the solar system, as well as the price and timing movements of stock markets and the foreign currency exchange. Next lecture I will also show how important it is in quantum mechanics. With all the attention it has received, you would think that this number would be recognized as an important universal constant, certainly as well known as pi. But this controversial number usually gets little more than a passing mention in the curricula of most academic institutions. Why? Indeed, many confusing and polarizing claims have been made about its appearance and application. Even the small minority of people who know of it really know very little about it. Does it belong to the realm of conspiracy theory, or are these curious minds who discern its latent treasures onto something? I'll let you in on the many claims and counterclaims and unveil the evidence like a good mystery novel or an episode of CSI. In this case, though, you are the detective, judge, and jury. You decide for yourself. If the claims are true or false, or if they are grounded in math or myth. In the end, you may not know for certain if it was just a very strange coincidence or evidence of a grander design. Intrigued? The more you understand about the math behind the golden ratio, the more you'll appreciate its appearance in nature as well as the arts, and the more you'll be able to apply it in creative artistic expressions that are virtually limitless in their applications. Let's begin our exploration of this very broad, deep, and fascinating subject by taking a little walk through history, exploring the lives of several of the diverse cast of characters who played a role in this timeless story. Euclid is a good way to start. Although little is known about his origins, Euclid lived in ancient Alexandria around the 1st century BCE, when Ptolemy ruled over the Hellenistic kingdom of Egypt. Comprised of 13 books, Euclid's Elements contains illustrated definitions, postulates, propositions, and proofs covering geometry, number theory, proportions, and incommensurable lines, which are those that cannot be expressed as a ratio of integers. It was a foundational work in the development of logic and modern science, and today it's regarded as one of the most influential textbooks ever written. first printed in 1482. It was one of the earliest books on mathematics to be produced after the invention of the printing press, and is likely second only to the Bible in the number of editions published. So it's well established, and especially it became very important for the painter, inventor and polygenius of Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci used this in all his aspects of production, from his physical laws to his innovations in machinery, his chemistry, what he did in politics, how he casted statues, his painting, his literature and his poetry. For him, all those areas was one holos, and that holos made it possible for him also to be distinct. To when he was painting alone. And this is one of the most exacting things with the Phi. It gives distinctiveness at the very same time as it gives generality. And that can't be said by anything else in mathematics. This is unique for Phi. And sometimes I've thought about Phi like a sword that's very sharp, or an axe, or some sort of sword that is extremely broad at the base, where it can cut like an axe or be like a saw, but in the tip it is much thinner than the needle, so it can be absolutely exact. And I would say there was a development, it was a completely different take on mathematics, maybe from the start of the Middle Ages and onward, and that took a turn into neither generality nor distinctiveness, somewhere in between, very blurry. And I think this is caused by the heightening of consciousness into the reflective mind, which just sees contradictions in a very brute way, coarse way. Distinctions are made by the reflective consciousness, and no, I would say the heart consciousness is what is able to do distinctions and being general at the same time, whereas the reflective consciousness, the ego self, can only do generalities in a very medial way and uses contradictions. The head intellect is always non-contradictory, non-paradoxical, and this is one of the reasons Edward de Bono called true rationality asymmetrical. It needs to be asymmetrical, because the world in itself, remember the Necker cube, is in itself asymmetrical. It's very close to the fractal. I see the illustrations in the book that are very hard to sort of communicate to you listeners and viewers, but it's very, very visual, the whole thing. Very interesting. You can see in the cauliflower the Phi number acting, and this of course one could call the Phi the pi of fractals. Phi is the pi of fractals that really works, whereas pi does not work with fractals. Phi is paradoxical, but still gives result. Pi is non-paradoxical and doesn't yield results. Pi is extremely limited. You can't use pi in other than a very, very small fraction of science, whereas you can use phi all over the whole and at the same time be allowed to be incredibly distinct. Incredibly distinct. As I mentioned in the early section here, this has connection to Judi Currivan and her book The Cosmic Hologram. I think it's just fantastic. It's so odd that the person that is usually seen as being uninformed has such a general and good take, and marvelous writer as well. I think for the most part she was an incredibly successful business person, traveling all over the world for 20 years, got her richness. She already knew intuitively that the standard way of doing things did not work, or the standard way of thinking. If you want to be successful, you cannot follow pi, you need to follow phi. And in the following chapter I continue where I stopped in 1136. Think of what I mentioned about phi and pi and that difference. I'll say pi is possibly the head constant, and you can call phi the heart consciousness constant. I think that's pretty fair. And remember that the lowercase phi is the inverse, that is 1 through phi. That will return because it shows that the reversal is similar but at the same time very dissimilar. When it comes to pi, p, that is not the case. A reversion of pi doesn't yield anything. Pi is non-paradoxical. It is not of this world. This is chapter 11. Who makes our perfect universe? And now I will bring in all what I said in the beginning, and also the insights from Richard E. Lind and what I read at 1136 from Judi Currivan, into further the thing, broaden it as much as possibly. An informed universe requires an informer. Look up at the stars and not down at your feet. Try to make sense of what you see and wonder what makes the universe exist. Be curious. From Stephen Hawking, physicist. Many pioneering scientists including Planck, Heisenberg, Schrödinger and Einstein, have come to stand alongside spiritual seekers from all eras to gaze into the yet unknown and ask the question of who or what creates our perfect universe. Indeed, from a letter he wrote in 1936 to young student Phyllis Wright, Einstein's viewpoint holds that everyone who's seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that the spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe. A spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we, with our modest powers, must feel humble. I would maintain that we are now at the threshold where the next steps in revealing the essence of this great mystery are at last capable of integrating evidence-based and faith-based perspectives. The growing scientific perception of the informational nature of all that we call physical reality is, at the same time, showing it to be informational, literally informing in its entirety and encompassing all from its simplest to its most complex forms. In other words, our universe is composed not from the all-pervasive presence of merely arbitrarily accumulated data and accidental processes, but ordered, patterned, relational, meaningful, and intelligible information. Exquisitely balanced, incredibly co-creative, staggeringly powerful, and yet fundamentally simple. The information present from the very beginning of space and time, as simple as it could be put, but not simpler, provided the essential instructions from which our 13.8 billion year old universe has facilitated the evolution of ever greater levels of complexity. The informationally entropic progressions of its known locally connected intelligence has and continues to co-creatively express, explore, and experience on all scales of physical existence. As it advances to the embodiment of progressive self-awareness. As there cannot be an informed universe without the existence of an informer, without anthropomorphizing such creative impetus, the inevitable question that these scientific revelations come to is, who or what is the ultimate intelligence that makes our perfect universe? We'll now pose this essential query and see how the emergent understanding of the cosmic hologram offers a visionary perspective and new insights, both on this age-old enigma and in answer to it. As there cannot be an informed universe without the existence of an informer. I think that is great. Think about the de-anthropomorphizing that was going on already in Xenophanes. This tendency is age-old. The lure of taking humans out of the picture. And I think Xenophanes might be the best example. Just because the gods look like humans, they cannot be gods. That is in itself a fault. Of course, he had left the heart consciousness, the heart soul, and everything anthropomorphic became bad or non-working. We'll now pose this essential query and see how the emerging understanding of the cosmic Hologram offers a visionary perspective and new insight, both of this age-old enigma and in answer to it, with the increasing evidence that ours is a finite universe within an ultimately infinite cosmic plenum. It's also now an appropriate time for us to address notions of a multiverse of other universes beyond our own. Our informed universe, the French philosopher and author Marcel Proust once stated, "The real voyage of discovery consists of not seeking new landscapes, but having new eyes." So has it been throughout the history of humanity. We come repeatedly to expand our vision of the world and see it and ourselves anew. With new data, we can amass further information and perceive the meaningful information it encodes. From its intelligence, we can progress to knowledge and onward to incorporate its strands into an interweaving tapestry of unfolding wisdom. We began our exploration of the cosmic hologram by referring to the poetic and profound vision of the ancient Vedic sages of Indra's net. Describing the holographic expression of the infinity of cosmic mind, we find ourselves some 3 millennia and countless discoveries later coming to essentially the same perspective, albeit recounting it in very different language. This developing convergence of views continues with an acknowledgement of the innate and all-pervasive intelligence that flows throughout and indeed makes up everything that we call the physical world. Our universe soul, I think it's a good name, universe soul, journey of the past 13.8 billion years, has progressed from its radiant beginnings to the geospheres of planets, onto the emergent and complex biosphere we are members of on our own planetary home, to the globalized technosphere of the early 21st century. To where now do we journey? What do we now need to see, and with what new eyes? The technosphere we currently inhabit and the internet are enabling the enmeshing of our societies into a global whole. We have access to vast new levels of information that flow as never before. This technosphere connects us literally as a world wide web, raising and reflecting both the commonality of our human experiences and their diverse expressions. At its perhaps most opportune, it offers us way to appreciate, share, and enhance universal values while learning to celebrate and honor our differences. It also, without precedent, enables us to come together at moments of great inspiration and joy or of deep sorrow, revealing what has been, what is, and what may be, for good or ill, and like no other resource before, it encourages and sometimes forces us to collectively view with new eyes. What we then can and are willing to comprehend, how we choose to respond, and to what degree we're prepared to participate in being the change, as Gandhi said. We wish to see the world is up to us. In the years following the cataclysm of World War I, the concept of the noosphere, that derives from the Greek word nous, meaning mind, was developed by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Edouard Leroy, and Vladimir Vernadsky. In thinking about the future of humanity, these three visionaries saw ahead to a potential for the processing of increased complexity to evolve from an environmental biosphere to such a collective and unifying human and essentially planetary consciousness. Now, almost a century later, the emergence of a technosphere that they never envisaged may come to be appreciated as being a necessary transition, is enabling the whole of humanity to see itself, ask the fundamental whys and why nots of our lives, and set them in a wider context of the nature of reality itself. In the never again time after the global conflict of the First World War, Teilhard perceived such a noosphere as embodying the victory of love over the forces of fear. Indeed, he considered that love is the affinity which links and draws together the elements of the world. Love, in fact, is the agent of universal synthesis, while the golden ratio is often pointed here. New discoveries are increasingly providing support for Teilhard's universal synthesis in the innately whole world of the cosmic hologram. At the same time, the technosphere is revealing the peril of global breakdown unless we come together as a human family and act inclusively, justly, and compassionately toward each other, and responsibly for our one and only planetary home. It may, and hopefully will be, but only if we so choose, that as we approach the centenary of the far-sighted vision of the noosphere, that we are able to overcome our fears and denial, and finally cross our next evolutionary and critical threshold to embrace its awareness. Cosmic mind. Beyond the complex plane in its investigation of the non-physical realms, science is only just beginning to catch up with the numerous experiencers of past millennia. Its discoveries in the years to come will almost certainly shake our perceptions, not just of the world out there, but at far greater and more personal levels, for they're likely to directly encounter the presence of a grander, ultimately infinite and eternal intelligence, of which we are microcosms, droplets of the great cosmic ocean, sparks of the great cosmic flame. The ongoing revolution in our understanding of the true nature of what we call physical reality and its inherent insubstantiality was only the first step of our journey. The next challenge is in perceiving how cosmic minds constructs and realizes the informational and holographically expressed natures of ours, and the possibilities of other finite universes. This is the pioneering scientific work in progress of seeking to understand the cosmic hologram. Along the way, the perceived separation between mind and matter falls away, and the illusory dualism that has been under increasing threat from scientific discoveries over the past century can finally be resolved into the emergent understanding of the all-pervasive unity and the wholeness of all-compassing mind. Realizing. Neuroscientists, psychologists, and psychiatrists are coming to recognize that we don't perceive a direct representation of external reality, but instead our senses and brains operate as a translation and integration service to our innate consciousness. What we think, feel, and believe, whether or not it's true, significantly affects our notions of what's real. The old adage, seeing is believing, is being turned around to become believing is seeing. As numerous studies and experiments have shown that we literally see what we believe, that we see what we expect to see. Psychologists have demonstrated that when our attention is distracted, we miss otherwise obvious events and co-create the realities we perceive. Proclivities often expertly manipulated by mentalists such as the UK's Derren Brown. Well, do check out Derren Brown. He would put your rather naive conception of a reality out there or in there to the test. It is an illusion that we understand and perceive the world. And what Judi Currivan and of course Richard E. Lind is pointing to, we need to get to reality once more, and that reality is both within and without. Yes, paradox once more. A well-known and jaw-dropping example is the phenomenon of change blindness, demonstrated in an experiment carried out by psychologists Daniel Simmons and Daniel Level in 1998. Such reality myopia occurs when our attention is diverted. Researchers have concluded that change blindness is due to lack of informational attention before and after the distraction, so the brain fills in the gaps and concludes that no change has occurred, even when one actually has. Simmons and Levin's experiments was conducted at Cornell University. Experimenters held a campus map and asked passersby for directions. After about 15 seconds of giving directions, two further experimenters, together carrying a door, walk between the conversers with the initial experimenter who'd be asking the way, switching places with the one carrying the back of the door, who then took the first experimenter's place in receiving help from the passerby. Well, that's a good experiment. When the passerby completed giving directions, the experimenter explained that he was conducting a psychological study of how people pay attention, and asked whether the passerby had noticed anything unusual when the two people carrying the door went by. If the response was no, the experimenter then asked whether the passerby had realized that he or she wasn't speaking with the same person who'd initially approached to ask for directions. More than half of the passerbys failed to notice that the person whom they had been speaking with had changed into another stranger in the middle of their conversation. Follow-up experiments reveal that unless there is some sort of vested interest in an encounter, such as when the appearance of the individual is relevant, even a radical change, as for instance switching people in mid-events, goes unnoticed. I recommend the YouTube videos Just for Laughs. Look for Door, and they change people from very young blonde girls of American origin to old Chinese men, and no one tells the difference. Well, in the videos they usually take the one that notes the difference, because that is more funny. But in somewhere 60-70% of the cases, even with an old Chinese person, they do not notice the difference. While such extreme examples reveal, but they're no longer extreme, because Just for Laughs have produced, I think, 10,000 episodes. They are a very successful enterprise today. Reveals change blindness in more than half of those tested, despite most people thinking that in less exceptional situations, such levels of inattention wouldn't generally happen to them. It occurs for nearly 8 out of 10 individuals. Listen to this, 8 out of 10. And still people put their foot down and say they have access to reality. And I'd say when we left the heart consciousness, the heart soul, we left reality, because our embodiment is the only way to reality. The transcendental soul is defined and built up with things that are not of reality. And I'd say contradictions are not real. Well, lack of contradictions are not real. Depends from which position you perceive them. But from the perspective of the reflective consciousness, reality is contradictory and reflective consciousness is coherent. But from the view of reality, there are no paradoxes. This is very important to understand. We only have very clear thinking. Excuse me. One could say the substance that builds up the reflective consciousness strives, as Hilbert wanted, to have non-contradictory, coherent and cohesive function of the thing, which is an impossibility. The reflective consciousness is built upon impossibilities. Therefore, it's insufficient for perception, which is itself on the side of the reflective consciousness, the ego self, paradoxical. Scientists over the past couple of decades have also tested how what we think and believe actually alters our physiology. For Eastern practitioners of mind-based traditions such as meditation, such abilities have always been self-evident. But in recent years, Western scientists have studied and increasingly corroborated such claims. In 2002, the Harvard Gazette reported a series of experiments beginning in the 80s and directed by Herbert Benson of the Harvard Medical School that investigated the Tibetan Buddhist meditative practice of Tum Mo. Not only were the monks involved in the experiments able to demonstrate a conscious ability to reduce their metabolism by up to 64%, but also to significantly raise their body temperatures. Translated as, and I don't think this is a coincidence, as inner fire, Tum Mo's visualization and focusing technique has been used for many centuries as the rite of passage to prove a monk's level of adeptitude. The practice involved using a concentration to produce sufficient inner heat to endure a night-long meditation in the freezing cold, sitting naked on the snow. With similar spiritual practices honed over millennia, Hindu yogis are also now being subjected to scientific investigation of the renowned powers to control bodily pain through the power of thought. In 2004, a team of researchers with the lead author Eric Pepper of San Francisco State University reported their study of yoga master able to pierce his tongue and neck with skewers while suffering neither pain nor bleeding. Experimental measures show that a coherently high level of alpha brain waves associated with deep yet alert relaxation reveal this ability to consciously reduce the electrical activity in his skin, thus reducing pain response and blood flow. The same lowering of electrodermal activity and consequential suppression of pain had also been demonstrated in an earlier 1999 experiments of hypnotism by Vilfredo de Pascalis and others, whose subjects display the same physiological response, but this time to hypnotic suggestion rather than their own conscious volition. Beliefs can consciously or subconsciously have the same effect. In the West, the well-known placebo effect, where someone's expectation of health improvement due to a particular treatment or medicine, despite the placebo being neither treatment nor medicine, nonetheless leads to a real alleviation of symptoms, including pain relief. A pioneering experiment in 1996 by psychologists Guy Montgomery and Irving Kirsch at the University of Connecticut treated students with an ostensibly new topical painkiller they called trivaricane, only containing water, iodine and thymol. It had no active ingredients. Yet when painted on one index finger of each student and then having the index finger of both hands squeezed in a vice, the student consistently reported significantly less pain in their treated finger. As such an experiment and many others since have shown, the placebo effect is not the result of an actively positive thinking, but a genuine belief, albeit erroneous in itself, in the power of treatment to cure So once again, the mind is shown to be able to control the physical response of the body. In contrast to the placebo's beneficial effects, the associated and equally real so-called nocebo effect results in negative responses. In studying the responses by subjects to nocebo suggestions, physiologist Fabrizio Benedetti at the University of Turin Medical School has shown a hormonal response by the pituitary and adrenal glands, both of which respond to threats to our body with a fight or flight response. Literally, if the belief and consequential fear were sufficiently powerful, such a response could be lethal. In 2014, Benedetti proposed taking more than 100 students on an alpine trip, warning one of them beforehand that such high altitude could cause migraines. By the time of the journey, he found his comment had spread to more than a quarter of the participants. Those who'd heard the gossip not only had the worst headaches, but an analysis of their saliva also showed a heightened response to low oxygen levels and an increase in enzymes associated with altitude sickness, beyond that demonstrated by other students. Social infection had become physicalized. I myself had this as an experience. I suffered from severe seasickness and also motion sickness. And at one trip when I was 13 years old, going from Denmark to England, I was offered a pill called Silica T9 or something of that sort. And they relieved my seasickness, and I was given the whole box of the pills, and I used it for at least 10 years. Every time it works spiffingly perfect. Then I went to the pharmacy to ask for more when they were finished, and they told me, "You've been eating sugar pills." Actually, normal seasickness pills were quite strong. Never did the same effect as the Silica T9. And I think they show that we are participating equally in the real world. We are not cut off as the transcendental ego or the self or the reflective consciousness constantly assumes. Such body-mind effects seem to be increasing. In a 2009 article, Wired magazine's Steve Silberman reported that in the United States, from 2001 to 2006, the percentage of new drugs cut from development after phase 2 clinical trials, when they are first tested against the placebo effect, rose by 20%. In more comprehensive phase 3 trials, the number of potential drugs failing tests increased by 11%, mainly as a result of poor comparison against placebo effects. Despite continuing high levels of research, progressively fewer new medicines are being launched, owing to their inadequate performance against placebos. Silberman also reported that if follow-up tests on drugs that have been on the market for many years were now carried out, some would also fail for the same reason. Two comprehensive analyses of antidepressant trials also revealed a significant increase in placebo response since the 1980s, with one estimating a doubling of placebo effect size during that period. Significantly, it's not that the old drugs are getting weaker, but the placebo effect appears to instead to be strengthening. This has been put down to a number of factors: increasing levels of advertising and drug tests in the developing countries heighten the level of expectation of a drug's efficacy. The increasing use of psychological drugs such as antidepressants also tends to affect the same parts of the brain associated with emotions and beliefs. While all these aspects no doubt contribute, may it be that the further influence is that both individually and collectively our underlying state of consciousness is increasingly and more powerfully creating our realities, in which case the informational interplay between our thoughts, emotions, and physiology may be exhibited by such correlations with both placebo and nocebo effect. As we've seen throughout this book, psychological researchers alongside those in the physical sciences are also converging on the understanding that there is no real separation between a so-called observer and that which is observed. Nonetheless, while there's an increasing appreciation that consciousness is primary to and co-creates our realities, as yet few leading-edge scientists have been willing to engage, other than philosophically, with the notion that all reality literally is consciousness at work and play. Neuroscientist and psychiatrist Giulio Tonini and Christoph Koch are probably closest to a breakthrough in understanding the primacy of consciousness with Tonini's theory of integrated information. Whose level of coherence is greatest during waking awareness, breaks down during deep sleep, and returns again to a high level during dream or REM sleep. REM sleep is rapid eye movement sleep. It currently, though, remains a big hurdle for many scholars to come to the recognition that our bodily senses and brains process and interpret the continual communication of the I, or indeed I, of our individuated microcosmic consciousness with the we of our mesocosmic collective human planetary awareness and the holographic entirety of our universe. Very interesting that she mentions I as in E-Y-E, as I. Remember what I read from Richard E. Lind 4 lectures ago, that I and tension around the I is connected to reflective consciousness. And I think what happened is that we lost our individual I, we also lost the collective I, the we. They were both gone in the heightening of reflective consciousness to the head and beyond. So I think that is a returning theme, and that is also part of the Phi. The Phi shows that we need both distinctiveness and universality. The reflective consciousness is built on the structure of what it perceives to be some sort of generalized contradictions, and trying to avoid those and having only one side. And although how convincing that seems, we need to understand that logic as a formalized system has never been able to produce any predictive results in any human endeavor. It's completely formalized. It can, however, be used in a very, very narrow space, a bit forehanded. that in all things, in innovation, in exploration, in the creativity that is rationality, it is never ever used. But afterwards, a posteriori, it comes in as a communicative tool, and as such is effective. It's also effective in sorting and sort of displacing. Think of Barbara Tversky's decontextualization and recontextualization. So it's a tool, but don't mistake the tool for the thing. Very important. Realizing that everything we call physical reality is the expression of the informational intelligence of cosmic mind completely reframes the question of human and indeed all consciousness and cognizance. The view of most neuroscientists has been that our consciousness somehow arises from the brain as localized phenomenon. Just as a turbine generates energy, so the view goes, our brain generates consciousness, somehow. That final somehow is crucial. While neuroscience has managed to map neural networks in the brain, identifying which areas light up during certain mental processes, and progressively noting their holographic nature, there remains no mechanism for the integration of neural activities with the immaterial perception of self-awareness. The final somehow is crucial. While neuroscience has managed to map neural networks in the brain, identifying which areas light up during certain mental processes, and progressively noting their holographic nature, there remains no mechanism for the integration of neuronal activities with the immaterial perception of self-awareness. Based on numerous experimental data on the known locality of our consciousness, an alternative has been to view the brain instead as a computer, a receiver and transmitter of known local information. However, with increasing discoveries and the emerging understanding of the cosmic hologram, the computer-brain-mind metaphor is also coming to be seen as too limited in its perspective. Not only does it fail to account for the interdimensional communications reported extensively by transpersonal experiences, but, and even more fundamentally, it still implicitly suggests a duality between the physical world and consciousness. Instead, the paradigm-shifting view of the cosmic hologram, which recognizes the actual immateriality of the physical realm and the ultimate unity of consciousness, is offering a new view of the brain and its purpose. By identifying the brain as playing an important role in the informational organization of the embodied awareness of human beings, it redefines each of us as a unique microcosmic individuation of the intelligence of the cosmic hologram of our universe, literally making us co-creators of reality. Now she's dwindling into quantum mechanics. Very interesting. Existence, experience, and evolution. Following Russian theater director Konstantin Stanislavski's lead, acting coach Lee Strasberg introduced the idea of method acting to the United States in the 1920s. Such method immerses an actor in the personal identification of the role he or she is playing, often remaining in character not only when on stage or on a film set, but also beyond. As individuated consciousness, when we incarnate on Earth, most human beings also undertake a process of such acting, where as spiritual method actors, we immerse ourselves in the drama of our lives by identifying with the roles we play. And as we've seen, the erroneous perception of materiality, we may marginalize or even forget our innate spiritual consciousness. The ego of our self-awareness instead immerse us into the perception that we are separate both from each other and the world around us. The personas we inhabit during our lives are thus the lenses through which we perceive the universe, how we relate to it and how it relates to us. By being embodied within the holographic harmony of our universe, we are literal expressions of its creative learning. Through its inherent relativity, reflections, resonances, and ultimate resolutions, we microcosmically express its existence, experience, evolution, and emergence. Such a recognition not only reconciles, but also integrates the space-time experience of cause and effect with the spontaneous awareness of non-local consciousness that transcends physical reality. Within space-time, the informationally entropic flow of time enables the choices and consequences of the life-learning expression universal consciousness to progressively ensue, while as an innately integral and non-locally connected entity whose consciousness ultimately transcends space-time, the experiential co-creativity of our finite universe informs itself. And the infinite plenum of the cosmic mind. This majestic view of ourselves and our universe, reflecting that of ancient spiritual wisdom, offers us an expanded and newly articulated vision of reality. And our own roles in this unfolding as being fundamentally purposeful and meaningful. Once more, I would like to take in the reflective consciousness here. People used to have, and still have in some areas of the world, purpose, always seeing them part of the surrounding world, co-creator in that, and progressive. And also they always stated that to lose one's soul is to lose everything. Then you have nothing left. You don't have cognition, you don't have rationality, you don't have intention, will, sternity, fastidious, morale, conscience, or consciousness. To lose one's soul, one's heart consciousness, was the worst thing that could ever happen to anyone in all the cultures described by Richard E. Lind. I think that is pointing to a very important thing. We take this loss as part of the world, and our sense of loss of meaning as part of the world. Let me cite, for instance, Carl Sagan: we are just ants in an enormous universe. We won't affect anything. That is the loss of the heart soul. And Jacques Monod may be the best as explaining. When you read Jacques Monod, the French receiver of the Nobel Prize, Nobel laureate in the 60s, he wrote a book, and he said that the universe, the more we explore it, the more we understand it is utterly meaningless. All those things comes from the ego self. They are included in the ego self. And without that, we go into all aspects of reality, not just the one that all the other philosophers done. And that is directly trying to seek meaning. We need to look into physics, we need to look into how rationality is constructed, how our bodies works, and what are true contradictions. Otherwise it won't work. It will be the same futile hope for a reunification, always going in the right direction, and possibly letting our hope being so intense that we strive too early without understanding. Preemptive understanding, I would say, is the start of the problem. Mistaking the result for the cause, mistaking a posteriori for a priori, mistaken Roger Federer, what he was doing on the tennis court, for what you see as a spectator. Quite a massive mistake. It's like you don't even know your own position. It's almost like a pre-schizophrenia of sort. Those two situations has nothing alike, and above all, one is before and one is after. You cannot be in the before if you're not engaged in it. You can't have what maybe the reflective consciousness perceive as a passive reality. It doesn't really exist. You can't understand why lying down or slouching. Slouching is the effect of the reflective consciousness. And so is tensing. Why would we tense if we were in the world? We wouldn't. Next paragraph is the wrong question. We've arrived at a point where, given the ubiquity of consciousness, it seems clear that asking who or what makes our universe is the wrong question. For progressively, our scientifically based understanding is showing that there is no real separation between maker and what's made. The appearance of such division is solely the perspective from which individuated aspects of consciousness may view their own holographic and holarchic imagery. The eternal intelligence of cosmic mind finds a finite expression through the dynamic co-creativity of our universe. Its existence, experiences, revolution, and eventual demise is a unified and non-locally cognizant entity, one of the infinite such expressions of the oneness of all that is. Has ever been and ever will be. Thus, each of us in a microcosmic and unique expression, playing our own co-creative role in the unfolding self-awareness of the consciousness of our finite universe, and ultimately of the infinite cosmos. While this has historically been seen solely as a religious, or more correctly, as spiritual perception, this limitation is no longer the case. Instead, the emergent viewpoint of the cosmic hologram that scientific discoveries are increasingly revealing arrives at this same conclusion. God isn't out there, a creator of the universe and its creations, like Newton would say himself, would say that God is not even out there, it's even further away. Instead, the greatest breakthrough we may make as human beings in the 21st century is to recognize that we and everything that we call reality in all dimensions and realms of existence are God, or whatever term we choose for the infinity of cosmic mind, and that we are microcosmic co-creators of its ineffable reality. Births and deaths of finite universe and the infinite and eternal cosmos. The increasing acknowledgement of our universe being finite, yet the cosmic mind of the entire cosmos being infinite and eternal, inevitably also brings us to the consideration of some form of so-called multiverse within it, made up of other finite universes that also birthed, lived, and eventually died, bubbles of thought in the infinite and eternal cosmic plenum. While it could be argued that all concepts of possible multiverse scenarios are still in the philosophical and pre-scientific stages of development, a few clues and pointers are helping to focus our attention. To begin with, let's briefly review once again the increasing evidence for the finite nature of our own and thus other universes within an infinite plenum. First, on a fundamental level, the laws of physics appear to only operate with finite measures, which is incompatible with the premise of infinite space-time. The finite beginning of space-time also logically implies a finite ending. So does the internet informationally entropic process that not only gives time its starting point, an arrow, but literally constitutes our experience of time itself. Such entropy also correlates with spatial expansion and consequential temperature reduction, ultimately falling to absolute zero or thereabouts in a finite timescale, and when the process of increasing informational entropy reaches a universal maximum, and so ceases. Observationally, as we've seen, a 2003 examination of the energy patterns in the CMB show that longer wavelengths are missing, a cutoff that denotes a finite universe. More indications of ours being a finite universe continue to be discovered. In 2012, an international team of astronomers led by David Sobral at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, analyzed the presence of H-alpha photons emitted by hydrogen atoms in association with star formation. They show that half the stars that have ever existed were formed by around 9 billion years ago, that the rate of formation has been reducing ever since, and that some 95% of the universe's stars have already been formed. In other words, there remains only enough hydrogen in galaxies for a further 5% of stars still to be born, suggesting a relatively short future timeline of the order of perhaps only tens of billions of years, until all stars are burned out. When our finite universe does come to an end, the circumstances of how it will do so remain as yet unknown. One cosmologist who is venturing into this territory, however, is one of the greatest thinkers of this generation. In 2010, Roger Penrose, together with Vahe Gurzadyan, put forward the idea of conformal cyclic cosmology, CCC, as a model. Set within the framework of general relativity, CCC envisages a continuing and holomorphic series of universes, each expanding from finite and tiny beginnings to an endpoint that can be reinterpreted at the start of the next cycle. For each spatial scale or conformal cycle, called an eon, photons of light behave in the same way, so for light there is no boundary between one iteration and the next. The matter of fermionic particles, however, must convert such electromagnetic radiations as prerequisite for the conformal cycles to continue. By recognizing that space is essentially a geometrical construct, CCC essentially relegates it to an emergent phenomenon. Instead, it perceives the notion of time, and thus the flow of informational entropy, as more fundamental. Currently, the model doesn't consider the entropic maximization of information, equating to an endpoint at or near absolute zero, and holographically tie that to its perception of universal cycles. If it were to be modified to do so, Penrose and Gurzadyan's eons, instead of being merely cyclic, would more explicitly equate to universes evolving, with the experiences of each lifetime able to inform the next, and so perpetuate emergence on a grand scale. by emphasizing the significance of time and informational entropy. While the CC model views the cosmos as eternal, it implicitly refers to its only representing itself as a single universe undertaking such significant iterations. An alternative perspective places greater emphasis on the spatial aspect of reality, envisaging multiple universes, although without specifically addressing whether they are finite, and if so, how they meet their end. Instead, it considers how they might be born, not from infinitely hot and infinitely dense singularities, but from finite seed points. And to follow this line of thought is revisiting an extension to general relativity, known by the initialism ECKS after his proposers: Einstein, Elie, Catan, Tom Kibble, and Dennis Sciama. ECKS theory expands the conversation of angular momentum in the presence of gravitational field to the intrinsic spin of fundamental particles, and couples this with non-zero torsional effect. When first proposed by Catan in the 20s, it gained some traction. However, as its effect seemed at the time to be of no consequence, and its added complication made the equations of general relativity even more difficult to solve, it was marginalized. That is until Kibble and Sciama independently took further looks at its premise in the 1960s. The current interest in ECKS and some modification of it to incorporate the Planck scale and informational attributes of the cosmic hologram focuses on its insight in possibly determining what happens under extreme conditions of space-time, such as the centers of black holes or at the beginning of the Big Breath. The tiny linkage it posits between the torsion and the intrinsic spin of particles at extremely high densities causes a spin-spin interaction that replaces the infinity of gravitational singularity with a finite but minimum scale. In addition, at this minuscule level, it forms an Einstein-Rosen bridge, a so-called wormhole, budding up from and transcending the existing space-time of a collapsing black hole to create and informationally see the exponentially white hole birth. The minute but not singularity start of the big breath of a new universe. According to cosmologist Nikodem Poplavsky, not only does the ECKS model provide a finite birth process for universes, but also naturally explains the flatness and homogeneity of space without the need for any inflationary mechanism. And it is rare. We have many problems with the current universe model, and one is singularities and the other is the weird flatness of the universe and of the galaxies. The Milky Way is extraordinarily flat. It's like a disk with almost no extension but no depth, sorry. The intrinsic torsion involved in such a birth might imply that our universe too is spinning, This may also provide a correlation to an apparently preferred access to space, the so-called axis of evil, so termed by its discoverer. Wow, oh no, Max Tegmark and his colleagues. Well, we can borrow from the enemies as well. And could tie in too with a hypothesized perspective of a holographic bound of our universe being toroidal in shape. Toroidal in shape is very close to the Klein bottle. It means that the finitude and the start of the universe is part of the universe. It is not outside of the universe. Indeed, recent observations may begin to corroborate such an axis and universal shape. A 2011 study of the rotations of more than 15,000 galaxies, led by Michael Longo of the University of Michigan, discovered a counterclockwise or left-handed preference in the direction of their spins. While the excess is small, it's nonetheless significant. So while indeed there's still a lot of work to do, the clues are beginning to add up. It seemed at first that the CC model and the CKS mechanism may offer two incompatible versions of a universe, multiverse. While one focuses on time and the other on space, they both consider reality as being fundamentally informational in nature. By combining their approaches, I suggest that a multiverse scenario may emerge that considered both the experience of space and time in their innate relationship to be recognized, while also perceiving the infinity and eternity of cosmic mind to realize itself. Bringing together some versions of the ECKAS mechanism to bud new universes during the lifetime of existing ones, while the CCC notion that their cyclic end of lifetimes gave further existence in a new aeon also reflects major Indian traditions, including Buddhism and Hinduism of spiritual reincarnation. I would say it goes for all tradition because the heart soul is so made. This is the heart soul, the heart consciousness. It works that way. I now see it clearly. In doing so, it extends the concept of evolutionary processes way beyond biology and even beyond a single universe to the entire cosmos. Such a scenario essentially not only embodies the grandest perspective of the cosmic hologram, but also echoes the ancient Vedic notion of creation, as described in the Rig Veda. Innumerable individuated manifestations of consciousness coming into form and then continuing to evolve through countless iterations as the cosmic mind of the cosmic continues to eternally explore and co-create with all aspects of its ineffable self. Swami Vivekananda, it was marvelous because it's a bit of a coincidence. All the powers in the universe are already ours. It is we who have put our hands over our eyes. It's chapter 12 of the book. It's called Supernormal. By understanding that all that we call reality, not only the physical plane, but also beyond it, is consciousness exploring and experience itself on myriad levels. The cosmic hologram offers an all-encompassing model of the cosmos. As the emergence of the cosmic holograms whole world view expands our perception, it reveals there's essentially nothing that's supernatural or paranormal. Instead, experiences of non-local awareness that are capable of transcending space-time, while nonetheless extraordinary, should come to be seen as innate abilities. By liberating ourselves from limiting perspectives, we can begin to not only understand, but also consciously utilize the expanded insight by our inherent supernormal capacities, not merely to empower and benefit ourselves and enhance our own well-being and wholeness, but to appreciate and serve the ultimate oneness of all life. In 1995, the American Institutes for Research, AIR, reported back to the US Congress on a study they've been asked to undertake to review government-sponsored investigations by the CIA into remote viewing. Often referred to as parapsychological or Psi aptitude, remote viewing is when someone is able to gain mental impression of a distant object or scene. The conclusions by the two primary reviewers differed. One, who'd previously been open to the reality of remote viewing, was convinced by the evidence and in favor of then focusing how such psi phenomena works. The other, previously skeptical, remained unpersuaded. The oversight panel then elaborated a consensus that, while agreeing there was a statistically significant demonstration of the ability to perceive on such non-local basis, there was a disagreement as to whether it could be unambiguously attributed to psi or some unconfirmed experimental bias. Without clearly establishing the cause of the proven evidence, the panel also considered that even if it did exist, the experiments did not identify the origins or nature of the phenomenon. In other words, while the evidence was there, the members still disputed its validity, regardless of the lack of any proof of error or bias. They couldn't, in any case, understand how it could work. 20 years have gone by and many more psi-related experiments undertaken. The debate, however, between proponents, skeptics, and opponents of such abilities, in addition to remote viewing, include phenomena such as remote intention, telepathy, and precognition, continues to rage. Indeed, despite much contrary evidence that such phenomena are real, skeptics of parapsychology often dismissively refer to it as pseudoscience. Throughout the history of scientific discovery, theory and experiments have progressed rather like my husband's and my dancing. Sometimes one leads, sometimes the other. Occasionally we manage to be in step. She has humor. Where one or the other lags behind or fails to keep up, the dance can slow down or head off in an unsatisfactory direction for a while. Physics has been called the parent of other sciences, as the dance of its discovery is fundamental to our increasing understanding of the nature of reality itself. Its scientific children then tend to follow its lead, sooner or later. Its ongoing development means that physics, as we've seen, eventually encompasses new findings and apparent anomalies in an ever more expansive theoretical framework. While some may be harder won than others, such advances are intrinsic features of the scientific method and its primary aim to comprehend the physical world and how it comes about. And how true the physical world calls the shot these days. In the early 20th century, physics underwent a paradigm shift from perceiving things in a staunchly materialistic and dualistic manner to models based on relational fields of influence and energetic interactions. In 20th century, information theory is coming to stand alongside physics to expand and deepen our perception and reveal the even greater ephemerality of physical reality, the primacy of information and consciousness, and indeed the ultimate unity of cosmic mind. Some psychological and social sciences, especially those pertaining to human awareness, have barely caught up with the quantum and relativistic worldview, already a century old, while popularizing pioneers such as Fritjof Capra, David Bohm and Rupert Sheldrake. I have to add Gary Zukov and Dana Zohar, among others, have sought to expand scientific and public awareness. Most scientists are hardly yet cognizant that an even more transformational scientific revolution is underway, one that will radically affect not only their investigations, but their own personal awareness too. Lack of adequate theoretical frameworks hasn't prevented, let alone forced physicists to stop experiment or bar them from attempting to observe new and anomalous phenomena. For parapsychology, though, the lack of an adequate framework has often been used as an unscalable barrier to research. A commonly stated objection to such studies that while they may work in practice, they do not work in theory, has never been applied to any other scientific endeavor. There are many examples where this has been the case, including where the actual physical phenomena arising from the quantized nature of energy and matter and the relativistic nature of space and time has been utilized in There are many examples where this has been the case, including where the actual physical phenomena arising from the quantized nature of energy and matter and the relativistic nature of space and time has been utilized in numerous technologies, without hitherto the reconciliation of quantum and relativity theories, the two theoretical frameworks in which they are based. Although open-minded skepticism is not only healthy, but indeed crucial to scientific progress, in the case of psi phenomena, the skepticism has too rarely been open-minded and is often vehemently oppositional, even hostile, frequently from an a priori prejudice. The materialistic dualism embraced by many such opponents is, however, being progressively shown not to be a viable worldview. Instead, the developing perspective is about the cosmic hologram and the fundamental nature of consciousness is finally offering a theoretical context, a plausible mechanism within which to place and perhaps explain supernormal capabilities and occurrences. So let's now see how the idea of the cosmic hologram offers such basis, and so begin to finally answer the implicit question posed by the AIR reviewers 2 decades ago. How can psi phenomena work? There are a number of key points, all of which we already explored, but that are necessary for us to again bear in mind. The first is the fundamentally informational nature of reality and the ultimate unity of consciousness. The second is that human consciousness is not restricted to our brains or bodies. Third, non-local connectivity, which transcends space-time, is innate to our entire universe, enabling it to evolve as a single, coherent entity. Fourth is that within space-time, the entropic flow of information engenders both time's arrow, the flow of time itself, and the experiences of causes and consequential effects. Fifth, between all energy matter manifestations of a system exhibiting non-local behavior, there's no entropic transfer of information within space-time. Very important. Literally, the whole system behaves, and indeed, for the manifestation of its known locality, is integral, regardless of the apparent spatial or temporal separation of its manifested attributes. What one feature knows, the entirety of the phenomena spontaneously know. Compare that to Heisenberg's theorem of unknowability that I renamed it now. If you take one, you leave the other. You see a contradiction enters into the observing position of a posteriori. That happens not in the a priori thing. Then you have the whole. In order to have the whole, you need not to go into contradiction logic and such things at that stage. Yes, do it later, but the very important dividing line before and after can never ever be ignored. And I think that dividing line got confused, traumatized, maybe by a hit of some internal occurrence 400 to 500 BCE in the Mediterranean basin. Something happened, and it happened on a collective level. It did not happen within one philosopher or a group of philosophers. It did not happen with only one society, one city-state, one polis. It happened throughout. And my personal theory that should be ignored now and put in parenthesis is that water, thalassa, took a very important place. Water is homogeneous and it looks like a mirror. It can lend itself to that illusion. But that is most definitely my own personal theory. The materialistic dualism embraced by many such opponents is, however, being progressively shown not to be a viable worldview. Instead, the developing perspective about the cosmic hologram and the fundamental nature of consciousness is finally offering a theoretical context, a plausible mechanism within which to place and perhaps explain supernormal capabilities and occurrences. So let's now see how the idea of the cosmic hologram offers such a basis, and so begin to finally answer the implicit question posed by the AIR reviews 2 decades ago. How can Psi phenomena work? Sorry, I repeated there. Ignore the last one. 6. Before observation measurement, all possible states of a system are not only locally connected, but in physics speak are also described as being in superposition. Very important and not to be ignored, I would say. Often it is ignored. Finally, it is only when such non-locally entangled and superposition states are finally measured that they, to use physics jargon, collapse to a specific realization. One realization. This is when oneness occurs. Importantly, on measurement, unless such measurement is precisely set up to reveal their inherent non-local entanglement, the superposition states indeed collapse to a specific and so entropic and localized state within space-time. Taking all these points into account, we can see that supernormal capabilities are inherently non-local, involving informationally entangled perspectives of consciousness that transcend space-time. So while our everyday experiences reflect a localized realization, so the coherence of supernormal normality allows us to access our innate and indeed universal non-local awareness. In terms of spatially related remote viewing, intention or telepathy, a resonance occurs that creates a level of spontaneous correlation and conscious entanglement. As we later see, such supernormal phenomena are especially exhibited where there's heightened intensity, where there are focused attention, emotional bonding, or some sort of powerful image or occurrence. The supernormal attributes, though, that raises the greatest hackles in opponents tend to be those that seem to involve the transcendence of time, such as future, present, presentiment, precognition, past retrocausation, with their apparent violation of the principle of cause and effect. With regard to often cited claims of retrocausation, I feel a widespread misunderstanding exists, initially arising from an incorrect interpretation of a version of the famous double-slit experiment in quantum physics. The error then became expounded by the wrong conclusions regarding what's known as delayed choice experiments. In 2012, philosopher David Ellerman of the University of California explained how the mistake occurs through what he refers to as the separation fallacy. And he described why such experiments don't actually imply any causal violation. To explain, let's begin with the basic version of the double-slit experiment, which was originally used to show that the superposed wave-particle nature of energy matter. Most simply, this setup involves a beam of light being shown onto a flat plate in which are cut two parallel slits, and the light that passes through the slits is then viewed on a screen behind the plate. The wave nature of light causes it to go through both slits and then interfere to form a characteristic pattern of bright and dark bands on the screen. However, the light always appears to hit the screen at distinct points as discrete particles, the varying bands reflecting the differing levels of particles' impacts. If two detectors are each placed at a tiny distance between the two slits, so that a particle ostensibly going through the second slit isn't able to reach the detector placed behind the first slit. The common interpretation is that a hit at the first detector shows that the particle has gone through the first slit. Ellerman maintains that this is where the fallacy of apparent separation enters the scene. Its error is the assumption that the quantum superposition is already in a specific state, as the ostensible separation apparatus, the slit, rather than the detector, where information is accessed by its measurement. Ellerman points out that instead, for an incoming quantum entity, the separation apparatus actually creates a non-locally entangled superposition that continues beyond the slits and until the measurement when it collapses to a particular state. The separation fallacy mistakes the creation of entanglement for a measurement. That's incredibly interesting. Actually, I never heard about the element experiment. Do take note of Dr. David Ellerman. Now it gets really interesting. A delayed choice experiment envisages the sudden insertion or removal of the detectors after the particle has entered the apparatus, but before it would have time to reach them. The separation fallacy makes it appear as though by doing so one can retrocause a collapse, or not at the point of the particle's entrance to the separation device, the slits. Again, the fallacy is rectified by understanding that it's the separation apparatus, the slits, that actually creates an entangled superposition state of the alternatives that continue to evolve until a measurement is taken. Given too that a detector can measure just one collapse state, that specific state is determined by and only at the detector and crucially depends on how and what information is accessed. Dr. Ellerman. So incredibly interesting. This is actually happening live. Sorry about that mishap. I needed to put an extra point into David Ellerman. Enormously interesting. And oddly enough, it goes so great with the name of the book, but I never heard of Ellerman. Well, I heard his name, but I didn't know about his exploration. Given too that a detector can measure just one collapse state, that specific state is determined by and only at the detector and crucially depends on how and what information is accessed. A further critical point is that the entangled superposition is maintained until the final measurement, which always occurs in the present. The future is never measured. Non-locality is informationally non-entropic. Just as there is no information transfer through space, there is no separation or information entropically passing through, and indeed being the experience of time. Expanding Ellerman's insight, the superposition of the entangled consciousness involved in supernormal experiences is transcendental, both spatially and temporally, until the final measurement. In the case of retrocausality, there is no difference in the non-local perception of the present and the past within space-time. Information can only be accessed in the present when the superposition of entangled alternatives is measured and so collapses. So there is no violation of cause and effect, and the past that's already revealed isn't changed. While we'll review some other experiments shortly, the supernormal phenomenon of presentiment or precognition seems to corroborate that the informationally entropic process that is the flow of time does, however, differentiate between a past that's already happened and a future not yet physically manifest. In such precognitive cases, non-local awareness appears able to access a potentialized future whose superphysical information is crystallizing but not yet fully realized to form the present, while as yet there is little evidence to show how far ahead such potentialities may begin to assemble as informational attractors in the complex plane. They seem to essentially form the superphysical bow wave of space-time. This makes eminent sense from the perspective of the cosmic hologram and the superphysical and dynamic nature of the underlying informational pattern of physical reality. Again, and significantly for such precognitive awareness too, within space-time there is no violation of causality. So if we're now starting to approach a cosmological perspective that offers a framework for supernormal aptitudes of human awareness, we soon hit the next hurdle that has hampered investigation of these aptitudes. All authentic scientific research involves rigorous experimental methodologies and protocols that are capable of enabling and ensuring that experimental results can be validated and replicated. Even in so-called hard sciences of physics and chemistry, there are, though, inevitable variabilities in results. In his Introduction to Experimental Physics, Colin Cook wrote, "We repeat a measurement of number of times, make our best endeavors to get the same value each time, and fail. In the studies of more complex phenomena, variations in environmental parameters and circumstances, and the behavior of the phenomena being studied inescapably increase the difficulty in obtaining accurate, verifiable, and replicable data. Due to its inherent complexity and diversity, all experiments involving human consciousness are assiduously challenged to be demonstrable and able to be repeated." So the generic approach in medical, psychological, and social sciences relies heavily on individual case studies and collective meta-analysis of broad data sets to statistically prove a certain result or trait. For parapsychology, this challenge is heightened still further given that supernormal capabilities for the great majority of people are non-ordinary and fleeting. This is hardly surprising if, as we proposed, a fundamental purpose of our persona-based consciousness is to immerse ourselves in the experiential reality of the physical world, while supernormal phenomena and abilities puncture our preconceived notions of physical reality and our usual perception of being separate, which, as we've seen, are illusory. They categorically do not contravene the principles that play out within space-time, especially the flow of informationally entropic time. And the associated processes of cause and effect. In this sense, they are subtle yet ever-present reminder, if we care to see or listen, of the wholeness of all that we call reality and the intrinsic integrity of our perfect universe. At the same time that the cosmological model of the cosmic hologram is gaining traction, the unity of consciousness is being It's a scribble in the book. First scribble. I think it's hardly been read. Yeah, it's hardly been read. Yeah, someone read it. It's a scribble in the book that looks like a phi. Wow, you say. Well, and the unity of consciousness is being remembered within our collective psyche. Perhaps it can only be thus that our innate supernormal capabilities are emerging from the hinterland of superstition, pseudoscience, and denigration into the scientifically dawning and clear light of day. In our 2008 book, Cosmos, Erwin Laszlo and I gave an overview of the experimental evidence for supernormal faculties up to that point. We noted how researchers had recognized the challenge of biases, had progressively gone to greater lengths to ensure robust methodologies, and had continued to produce a plethora of positive experimental evidence for Psi. One quote sticks in my mind from the engineer-physicist Robert Jahn, the head of the Princeton Engineering Analysis Research Lab, who with his colleague Brenda Dune undertook nearly 3 decades of research and amassed an enormous archive of evidence for such phenomena. On his retirement in 2007, when the lab was then closed, he said, referring to those who adamantly opposed their findings, "If people don't believe us after the results we produce, they never will." End of quote. Since then, even more studies and meta-analysis have continued to show that increased experimental controls have introduced a substantial support for the existence of such phenomena. In addition to earlier investigations, meta-analysis of extrasensory perception by psychologists Lance Storm, Patricio Tresoldi, and Lorenzo Di Risio in 2010-2012, and by Storm, Tresoldi, and statistician Jessica Utz in 2013, of precognition by psychologist Julia Mosbridge, and of remote intention by psychologist Stefan Schmidt in 2012, all provide further proof. Non-local awareness is next paragraph, beyond space and time. Let's now briefly review some of the types of explorations into supernormal phenomena that are being undertaken. What clues from earlier studies are being reinforced, and what additional insights are emerging? We'll begin with those that exhibit non-local entanglement, that transcend spatial distance, remote viewing, remote intention, and telepathy. Over decades of studies, the accuracy of remote reviewing has been found to be enhanced when the viewer is in a relaxed, yet alert mental state of non-expectancy. Generally, this is facilitated by quiet and non-distracting surroundings, and under laboratory conditions, sometimes involving mild sensory deprivation, often called the Ganzfeld approach, intended to minimize the level of environmental noise. While it's called viewing, research has shown that the awareness reported isn't always experienced visually. It may also be heard, be felt in the body, or be generally impressionistic. Cognitive scientist Stefan A. Schwartz, a pioneer of remote viewing research, and others have also discovered that its precision also increases in relation to the scale of informationally entropic gradients. essentially the dynamic intensity of the images, objects, and occurrences that are being non-locally perceived. Significantly, those that are more powerful, emotionally engaging, or depict sudden or substantial change elicits the strongest and most specific responses. It seems that the combination of the quieted attention of the reviewer and the emotionally compelling nature of the target maximize the non-local superposition of the scope of awareness and shared information. Indeed, the yin-yang complementarity of the receptivity, where the cognitively aware, subconscious, or autonomous, by supernormal experiencer, and the intensity and dynamism of informational content of the event, target, or circumstances, the reviewer's consciousness is in non-local integration with, seem to be universal aspects of all supernormal phenomena. Until its closure in 2007, when its extensive body of research was placed on the auspices of the International Consciousness Research Laboratories, ECRL, in Princeton's Peer Lab, have principally studied the nature of human consciousness through its interaction with sensitive physical devices called random number generators, or RNGs. The experiments attempted to harness remote intention to alter the output of such RNGs, changing their randomly generated data to measure that include a higher informational content. While the effects were generally small, over millions of trials carried out by several hundred operators, the peer archive amassed highly significant deviations from random expectations. The result also demonstrated disparities between the performances of individuals over a period of time and between female and male operators. The lab also found that when two people telepathically work together in remote intention experiments, the results were measurably greater than either was able to effect alone. I had to add to this, remember Alice and Bob, and Alice's friend and Bob's friend? That is mainly a telepathic experiment, although cast in the shape of quantum mechanics. When monitoring group activities through the outputs of RNGs, such emotional attunement and coherence was especially noted. Group rituals and events at sacred sites, music concerts, and theatrical performances all generated larger RNG deviations, whereas mundane conferences and business meetings appeared hardly to engender a response at all. Now there's a surprise. So to have entanglement needs to be in a sacred environment with rituals and calmness and the communal sharing of liturgy, exactly as shown by Richard E. Linden. And the initiation rite is the opening of the heart consciousness. Without the rituals of the initiation rites, there will be no opening of the heart consciousness. Will not happen. And as our time, everything is distracted, we don't calm down, we cannot no longer listen to Renaissance music. We are put our minds into the reflective consciousness even more, and that will affect the results, the Pauli Effect. Telepathy is perhaps the most anecdotally reported supernormal phenomenon. And it's especially common between people who share some form of close emotional connection. Such report has been widely studied in the case of twins, with 1 of 5 identical and 1 in 10 fraternal siblings claiming such non-local perception. Extensive examples of such telepathic connection between twins has been reported by researcher Guillaume Playfair in his book Twin Telepathy, The Cyclic Connection. Again, the telepathic awareness tends to be at its strongest when one of the twins is in danger or undergoing an especially potent experience. In 2013, a purported and especially powerful telepathic bond was investigated between a 9-year-old autistic Indian girl, Nandana Unikrishnan, and her mother, Sandhya. Tested and documented by a team comprising a psychologist, a social worker, and an educator, and a witness by other nursing staff, Sandhya, while in another room, away from her daughter's presence, was giving a 6-digit number and a poem to memorize. Nandana was subsequently able to recite both without any prompting. Once more, its close emotional bond that significant as Nandana doesn't appear to have a conscious telepathic connection with anyone else. As in the case with other supernormal phenomena, some form of resonance is an important factor. That is, being on the same wavelength is significant. From the mid-1990s, researcher Dean Radin of the Institute of Noetic Sciences has been undertaking a series of experiments investigating presentiment, which is a physiological rather than cognitive response to yet to occur stimuli. In the experiments, volunteer participants are seated in front of a computer screen that shows randomly generated visual images from a larger database containing varying levels of emotional content. If you put a short break there, sorry. From the mid-1990s, researcher Dean Radin of the Institute of Noetic Sciences has been undertaking a series of experiments investigating presentiments, which is a physiological rather than a cognitive response to yet to occur stimuli. In the experiments, volunteer participants are seated in front of a computer screen that shows randomly generated visual images from a larger database containing varying levels of emotional content. Their electrodermal activity, EDA levels, that is, the electrical conductivity of their skin, is monitored before, during, and after they view their images. While unsurprisingly, graphic images produced higher intensities of EDA than visually calming images, what Radin has unexpectedly found is that such differences in response begin on the order of 2 seconds before the arbitrary image are flashed out onto the screen. Throughout the series of experiments, incidences of such presentiments have consistently been observed, and using the same methodologies have been replicated by a number of other researchers, including Dick Bierman of the University of Amsterdam, in 2002, a team at the Heart Math Research Center in California also found that the same presentiment showing up physiological this time in measuring heart rate. Rather than unconscious presentiment, 2011, social psychologist Daryl Bem of Cornell University submitted a paper focusing on precognition, the mental perception of future events, which was peer-reviewed and published in the Journal of Personal and Social Psychology. In his research, Bem utilized a number of common and widely accepted psychology experiments methodologies. But instead of running them forward in time, he ran them backward. One such generic experiment, proved in numerous instances, looks at the effect of subliminal messages on the response to subsequent image, which is an effect known as priming. For example, the word ugly subliminally flashed on the screen result in the responders taking longer to decide that an independently judged beautiful image later shown to them is indeed so. Bem instead ran the test backward and found the same effect time reversed, albeit much less pronounced. And priming, we discussed a lot with Jan Eiskens, is one of the most important effects of how to reconcile with the a priori and the a posteriori confusion, if you call it. Another common psychological trial has participants shown a series of words on the computer screen and then later asked to type randomly chosen words from the series. The typed words, as would be expected, are better remembered during a subsequent memory test of the initial list. Again, Bem turned this backward. His participants were instead first shown a full list of words, then asked to recall them from memory, after which words from the initial list were then randomly chosen by a computer. The participants were shown to have been better at recalling those words from the initial list that would later be randomly chosen. How interesting. In all, his studies continued for 8 years, involved more than 1,000 students and 9 different types of experiments, with 8 of the 9 demonstrating statistically significant precognitive effects. The furor of the paper unleashed was virulent. Despite Bem's undoubted authority in the field, his reputation as a meticulous researcher, the prestigious nature of the journal, and 4 peer reviews passing the paper. All relevant evidence is also showing that the acuity of non-local awareness, whether spatial or temporal, is substantially increased with the level of informational entropy. The dynamic informational content involved. As we've noted, researchers into remote viewing have found that the precision of responses increases in relation to the scale of informationally entropic gradients. That is, the intensity and dynamism within the images, objects, or occurrences that are being perceived. The more powerful, engaging, or transformational the target, the stronger and more specific is the reaction. Radin and Biermann's research into presentiment found the same correlation, with the response to powerful images being more prevalent. Premonitions, whether personal or collective, also tend to be far more associated with the precognition of danger and disaster. On September 13, 2001, in the aftermath of 9/11 tragedy, Sally Reinfeather, the director of Rhine Research Center in North Carolina, founded by her father, the renowned parapsychologist G. Bay Rhine, and a repository of precognitive accounts for decades, reported the largest number of premonitions ever received by the center in regard to public calamity. Wow! Over hundreds of remote viewing sessions in the 80s, Schwartz also discovered that there were images evolved from some form of significant alteration. It's this element that is most accurately picked up. This point has also been identified by physicist Edwin May, who in a series of experiments building on earlier investigations, co-authored a 2000 paper with his fellow researcher James Spottiswoode and Laura Faith in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. In it, they too correlated the specificity of non-local viewing of images to the level of dynamism of their informational content. In 2014, an international research team sponsored by the University of Southampton in the UK reported on a study begun in 2008 of the near-death, NDEs and out-of-bodies, OBS, experience of more than 2,000 patients in 15 hospitals in the UK, United States and Austria. This so far is the largest investigation of this type, aimed to determine whether claims of awareness during such experiences are real or hallucinations. Their findings led author medical physician Sam Parnia of the State University of New York and his co-researcher to conclude that the experience of death appears far broader than what is yet understood. They consider too that in some cases of cardiac arrest, which is synonymous with biological death, patients' memories of visual awareness are compatible with OBEs, out-of-body experiences, and may have corresponded to actual external events taking place during their cardiac arrests. More than a third of those resuscitated following cardiac arrests and afterward able to be interviewed reported coherent awareness but without any specific recall of events, suggesting, according to Parnia, that there are many that there may have been mental activity subsequently lost either because of injury or sedative drugs. 2% of those interviewed, though, exhibited full perception compatible with OBEs and with explicit seeing and hearing recollections. One case was confirmed using auditory stimuli during cardiac arrest, when consciousness appeared to be present during a 3-minute period of no heartbeat. This despite brain function typically ceasing within 30 seconds of heartbeat cessation and not beginning again until the heart is resuscitated. In addition, the memories were detailed and consistent with verified happenings. Their results, building on earlier smaller studies and many anecdotal incidents, have convinced Parnia and his co-researchers that the recall experience surrounding death merits a genuine investigation without prejudice. Irrespective of faith, belief, and even insight of personal experiences as reported by numerous testimonies, the cosmological perception of the essential unity of consciousness, as now exemplified by the Cosmic Hologram, offers a scientific basis that frees our awareness from its apparently physical restrictions. The expansion of this developing perspective not only no longer forces our consciousness to be viewed as being restricted to a physical body, but also liberates it from being tied to a physical lifetime. In a study in 2001, led by clinician Pim van Lommel and colleagues at the Rijnstand Hospital in Arnhem, Holland, also investigated patients revived after clinical death of cardiac arrest and their experience of NDEs, near-death experiences. Their research of 344 cases concluded that these are authentic experiences which cannot be attributed to imagination, psychosis, or oxygen deprivation. One of the significant findings from their interviews with those who had consciously experienced an NDE was a commonly expressed profound sense of peace, leading to a strong belief in afterlife and newly felt freedom from the fear of death. Such sentiments were not shared by those who had also undergone resuscitation but had no recollection of an NDE. There are 4 other related areas of non-local consciousness research that have been plagued by even more controversy and that relate to the potential continuation of psyche after the death of the physical body. These include investigations for evidence of such continuing awareness, the ability to communicate with this awareness, discovery of evidence for earthbound spirits or ghosts, and claims for reincarnation. Despite an enormous amount of anecdotal evidence across cultures and over many centuries and more recent recording in numerous case studies, the materialistic paradigm of reductionist science has nothing but derision for such experiences. Regardless, however, of where future investigations may proceed, hopefully with greater open-mindedness allied to rigorous experimental procedures, the holographic worldview of Cosmic Hologram and the essential monism of consciousness inherently encompass the possibilities for such phenomena. Extraordinary ordinariness. We shouldn't expect that supernormal attributes are other than extraordinary. Otherwise, our ordinary experience of being human would be significantly compromised. The method acting that persuades us of our human persona, our experience of the richness and manifest complexity of the physical world, and the co-creativity of its evolution would consequently be less convincing. The issue, however, is that by treating such non-ordinary awareness as non-existence, we've gone to the other extreme, persuading ourselves of the materiality and sole reality of the physical world. In doing so, the deeper meaning or purpose of our existence have been marginalized, and we have essentially separated ourselves from each other, from the wider cosmos, and for our own expanded consciousness. In 2014, psychologist Etzel Cardenia of Lund University in Sweden authored an open letter co-signed by 99 fellow academics from Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, mainland Europe, Iceland, Israel, Japan, Scandinavia, South Africa, the UK and the United States, that called for an open, informed study of all aspects of consciousness, including supernormal traits such as telepathy, remote viewing and precognition. The letter lays out that, contrary to the negative impression given by some critics, scientific research into parapsychology continues to be carried out in accredited academic institutions around the world, despite its prejudicial treatment by some opponents, its taboo status, the subjection of its researcher to professional and personal attacks, and lack of funding. It also points out that in the face of negative attitudes, scholarly and peer-reviewed articles supporting the validity of supernormal phenomena continue to be published in associated academic journals. Significant positive results, as we've seen, go on being reported despite the antipathy by some mainstream scientists and reviewers that have meant that for many years some journals have ignored these while encouraging the publication of studies showing null and negative results. Supernormal aspects of human consciousness are far too important to be marginalized, derided and deliberately misinterpreted, attacked unfairly or dismissed out of hand. The results of ever more strictly managed, comprehensively monitored and well-analyzed experiments require acknowledgement. As Cardenha and his colleagues states, dismissing empirical observations a priori based solely on biases or theoretical assumptions underlies a distrust of the ability of the scientific process to discuss and evaluate evidence of its own merits. The undersigned differ in the extent to which we are convinced that the case for Psi phenomena has already been made, but not in our view of science as non-dogmatic, open and critical, but respectful process that requires thorough consideration of all evidence as well as skepticism, both the assumption we already hold and those that challenge in them. Given the emergent understanding set up in this book that unifies reality and naturally incorporates supernormal phenomena and experiences, it is surely time for scientists to answer the challenge of Cardenha and his colleagues and undertake a thorough and open-minded investigations of the various aspects of such psi-phenomenon manifestations, with the potential to expand and transform human awareness. Co-creators. The action and participation in the dynamic process of bringing all that we call reality into existence. An individual can't create anything itself. All of our dreams come true with the cooperation and co-creation of other souls. Hina Hamshi, author of Your Life, A Practical Guide to Happiness, Peace and Fulfillment. I need to mention something from Richard E. Lin before we strive too far. And that is that it was recognized already in pre-modern time that loss of the soul was an actual thing. And we have experienced the loss of the soul And that is already happening in everyday life, not only in the afterlife. In some ways, it's the regaining of the soul that's most important. Otherwise, what are we to gain? And it's too much evidence coming from Richard E. Lind. It's like 8,000 sources. And they all testify to the same thing. And so there's the Greek philosophers saying they lack everything, they lost everything. And this so obviously desperate project of Western philosophy, and nowadays also of theologians, to preserve a very narrow niche where should be religious, spiritual, and having an eternal life, and the rest given to what they perceive to be science, something that we question in all of the 1100 lectures. People are not aware, and the preemptly giving up the soul. And how can they believe in eternal life if they don't have the soul? I think that is intellectual dishonesty to a massive level. It has horrendous effects. And I remember myself being exposed early on to priests, more or less newly examined out from the theological university or theological school in Skara. None of them believed, but they said, hope is nice, do believe. They could not have any concept whatsoever of a soul, but the exact same hope that Plato had, Aristotle, all the philosophers, gets its form, and it fuels us. We can do things. We can have a whole career as a priest or a philosopher or a human developer. I think especially the life of Mother Teresa is very true to that. She lived until she was in her mid-80s, if I remember right. She did not for a second believe in God or eternal life. Not for a single second. So you see, you can be the biggest superhero of religious people, not only of Christianity, because she was very important of both of Hinduistic and Buddhistic and, I have to say, New Age faith. She did not herself believe at all. It was a huge scandal when that came out, but I think it's true for most. How else was it already testified in pre-Christian time that this process was going on? And it entered into people who sort of corrupted the Christian faith into be this Xenophonian project of purity and man not being on earth. All those things that you can see so clearly from, I'd say, all 30, 40 of the pre-Socratic and then the post-Socratic philosophers. It's obviously. And it's the same terminology, it's even the same wordings. It's obviously copied. And what does the reflective consciousness do? Instead of having a consciousness of its own, it copies the community. This is a big part of my own idea. In the Scholastic Society of Greece that entered all areas beyond the sea, they spread this trauma, this disjunct between head and body to everyone. It's very hard regarding the theory of Richard E. Lind to see how that didn't spread. You don't need to even understand the language. It goes directly from heart to heart. The loss of a heart goes also from heart to heart. And the remaining thing is a loss of soul. This, although this is so convincing for everyone, 99% of the population, it is still not true. It is still not true from the most important source, physics itself. And that shows how convincing this belief is. It's experiential. And I had so many lectures, hundreds of them, and claiming this ordinary worldview not to be true. People still claim it. And I understand more and more how we can ignore 99% of our reality Listen to the example I gave earlier on, how people don't even see the change of personality going from a young girl who's blonde to a Chinese man who's bearded and of age. Our ability to block out once we're affected by everyone else is tremendous. And we have evidence, very, very true, that the effects of others are much more pertinent than reality itself. And Judi Currivan, she really puts down her foot here clearly to show that is not shared by only one source among hundreds. We have thousands of different subjects, but maybe 250 important ones. Of all those subjects, every single one, 100% supports the idea that man is disjunct from the earth. But most people won't believe that in their heart or in their soul or whatever. There is still an emotional hope going on of a survival. But that hope is not true. But they don't know in not 100% of these 250 sciences is there a foundation. In only one, and that is physics, there is not that truth. That foundation does not exist. So the foundation they all take, the separation of man from the world, is only true in one case of 250. Whereas the same goes for the equation of the theorem of Gödel. In so few cases it's not true. I think that should be enough though. If you just weigh the evidence, it will of course be a reductionistic worldview, because 99% of the population do adhere to that. But we need to be stern. We need to have the same admirable attention and intention as Judi Currivan has. Be stern in the face of massive attacks. And that attacks is mostly within ourselves and within, I would say, religion today. My experience is not so much with the church, but with New Age. And there I would say it's 100%. I never ever met upon any exception from that. And I'm 100% sure it doesn't exist. I think Mike Cross was the best example. A stern Zen Buddhist who spent 25 years of translating the Shobogenzo and other great masterworks by Dogen Zenji. And he came to the conclusion it was all a myth in the end of 25 years. I met him, and I think that is the drop that breaks the glass or makes the glass overflow. But still, it's not true. It's very convincing experience. At this very point, we need to leave our experience. I will not talk about leaving experience as common experience or das man, but I will go into next week, and that takes effort. It cannot be done just by reading a book. You need to physically, mentally, and soulfully go to the inner you, the stability. And it won't come easy, because we got used to fast fixes and we don't believe in the long run. No one, according to Hari Yuval and others, no one plan anymore. It's a good reason for that, because in their eyes, in their minds, in their souls, their whole experience, there is no need for anything longer than your own lifetime. So wrong, and not shared by the ancient. Well, I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.